To what extent did the Prohibition Act of 1920 affect Chicago? The 18th Amendment was a compromise between the government and temperance advocates. However, due to this compromise, major conflicts occurred in the 1920s that led to crime rates in Chicago rising as people tried to find loopholes to get alcohol. However, this isn't the first time that there's been a conflict involving alcohol. The year is 1791, around George Washington's presidency. In a newly independent country and founded government, to make a profit, the federal government imposes a new whiskey tax. The farmers aren't happy. Public outrage everywhere. The Whiskey Rebellion was the start of the conflict between Prohibition advocates, the government, and people opposing the movement. This conflict occurred again over 4 decades later when the first National Temperance Convention met in Philadelphia in 1833. 1833 was the year where the idea of temperance was brought to international attention. In Antwerp, Belgium, 550 delegates representing over 12 countries gathered to make what is now known as the International Meeting Against Abuse of Alcoholic Drinks. This idea was being highlighted on by the Belgian Minister of War, who was concerned about the number of soldiers who fought while drunk. But what simply started as abolishing alcohol from barracks grew into something much larger. The idea was already there. All it took was for someone to spark the movement. Women decided to bring forth a call to action. The start of the temperance movement began in a town called Hillsborough, Ohio. In the town, there were around 20 establishments that sold and manufactured alcohol. In 1873 to 1874, Alyssa J. Thompson and her 70-plus followers wanted to bring a stop to the abuse of alcohol in her town. Thompson held peaceful protests and successfully shut down many saloons. Women saw the success of Thompson had she influenced many groups of women in Ohio to stand up and protest against alcohol. The WCTU, or the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was founded in 1873. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was one of the most controversial movements at the time. They were notorious for generally disrupting the peace by protesting in front of stores. They had eggs, water, and beer thrown at them by customers in bars. The WCTU closed down 25,000 of these establishments. The Union and the Ku Klux Klan both supported Prohibition. There would be some members who were a part of both groups. The WCTU was also known for recruiting young children to join their cause, with most of those children not understanding what they were supporting. They would chant, "Tremble, King Alcohol, we shall grow up." Eliza J. Thompson had influenced many women, some who became famous members of the WCTU. For example, the great leader, Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation, or Mother Nation, did not enter the temperance movement until 1890. She was the president of the WCTU. She officially changed her name in 1903 to Carrie. As she said, it meant to carry a nation to prohibition. She is well known as being one of the most violent members of the temperance movement. Coming from her brutal past from nursing wounded soldiers in the Civil War, she carried around a terrifying axe which she used to destroy barrooms. She would protest in front of bars. She and her followers would say prayers and sing hymns. Nation and the WCTU helped pass the law in Kansas that was against the selling of alcohol. Carrie Nation, unfortunately, had died before the amendment was in effect. She died in 1911 at age 64. Women gained a lot of rights around this time and had more freedom than ever. Money flowed in. They gained the right to vote. Wife beating was considered illegal. Protests were going successful. However, this uprising in violence and crimes grew higher once the 18th Amendment had started to take effect. Many people started to come up with different ways to get around the amendment. Although many religious people considered alcohol a sin, they still used it for sacramental purposes. This led to religious alcohol being exploited as a loophole, where people could buy sacramental wine and get away with it since it was for religious purposes. This also led to men claiming to be priests so they could have easy access to alcohol. This just further shows the extreme lengths that people would go to drink alcohol, although this is not the only method. The need for alcohol led to an increased crime rate. This is because people were willing to do anything to get some alcohol. This led to overcrowded jails as millions of Americans were arrested. America's citizens who had never done anything illegal during other circumstances were suddenly becoming criminals. But adults weren't the only ones becoming criminals. Children, influenced by what was happening around them, also became involved in crimes. Child gangs were formed primarily in areas with a high population of immigrants and areas where poverty rates were high. Speakeasies grew as they fed the supply and demand for alcohol. Bootlegging and underground alcohol business boomed. Chicagoans exported alcohol from Canada into Chicago. People like Al Capone rose to the top. They accumulated wealth and power. Nothing was getting in the way of Al Scarface Capone. He even bribed public officials so he could continue his dirty work. During the time of the Prohibition, the South Side was controlled by Capone, and the North was controlled by Diane O'Banion. Diane O'Banion was the #1 bootlegger in Chicago before Al Capone. He was very rich and controlled most of the elections at that time by taunting and threatening voters. O'Banion grew stronger as the act was passed. He liked the excitement and the adrenaline of hijacking money from saloons and breweries. His most famous one was the Sibley Warehouse, where he gained millions of dollars from stolen liquor. O'Banion's death was the lighting of the torch for the battle between gangs of Chicago. There was no running away. The FBI was hot on his trail. They had finally caught up to Capone. He was arrested in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon. He faced a year in prison. After the 18th Amendment failed to uphold sobriety, the government ultimately realized that it was a futile movement. They were just wasting resources on an act that no one followed. So the 21st Amendment passed, repealing the 18th Amendment. By the time he got out of jail, there was no prohibition, which meant his business was gone. And even worse, he was arrested for tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He slowly grew weaker every night he spent in Alcatraz, and by the time he got out, he caught syphilis and died shortly in 1947. The Prohibition era was trial and error for compromises. They tried to end the conflict between the temperance advocates, like the WCTU, and the government. However, their compromise infuriated many citizens. The 18th Amendment had an impact on the nation because it was the first amendment to try and take rights away from the entire country, which was contradicting to what the Constitution was all about, which was supposed to be protecting our rights. The citizens that were upset ignored the 18th Amendment, the compromise, which resulted in the conflict that included a lot of illegal businesses like speakeasies, had gangs stealing liquor and selling it, sneaking in alcohol across Canada to the US, and the high increase of violence and crime rate. Gangs popped up in big cities like Chicago. There aren't the same gangs that there were in the 1920s. However, the gang presence is still very prominent in Chicago to this day. It's a huge issue. The number of arrests before the Volstead Act was enacted were 592,000. But that number rose to 5,557,310 during the first year of the Volstead Act being in effect. The Prohibition era aided to its legacy of corruption. Ovid Damaris, when describing the Prohibition, said, "From the moment of its incorporation as a city in 1837, Chicago has been systematically seduced, looted, and pillared by an Ionian horde of venal politicians, mercenary businessmen, and sadistic gangsters. Nothing has changed." The temperance advocates lost interest in the cause, which was another factor for the need for another compromise. To try and fix things, the government repealed the 18th Amendment with the 21st Amendment in 1933, and that was the end of that.